I guess I'm going to switch gears a little bit at this point, because we've heard lots of really great talks and posters on, I guess, on simple tractable models in the last couple of days, and that's been really inspiring. So thank you to everyone who talked about that. And I'm going to talk about what we're going to be doing with the community land model at the National Centre for Atmospheric Research in Boulder, where I work. And for those of you that don't know, NCAR, we receive sort of centralised National Science Foundation funding from the American government to make an Earth system model, and the idea being that we kind of collate ideas that sort of bubble up from the literature and the theories and the wider community, and kind of, I guess, basically sort of stick them all together and see what happens in Earth system predictions. So, I thought of this title about 5 weeks ago when I was like, I had about 3 hours of sleep, and so I'm not sure I can pull it off, but we'll see. But basically, some of this work that I'm going to present, I started a while ago, a sort of really long time ago, in fact, embarrassingly long time ago, when Josh Fisher and I were both postdocs on the Quest project, which Colin was the leader of. And when we were developing our nitrogen cycle model, Josh got really excited and optimistic, because that's how he is, and he made this dance, and if you can Google it, it's amazing. These are some of the lyrics that he put to this popular Kanye West song about how we're making climate models harder, better, faster, and stronger. And so I thought this work I'm presenting represents sort of, I guess, the sort of fruition of that effort. But do we actually did it work? Did we get any better yet? And Josh can spin around in his head, by the way, as I think this video reveals, so that's amazing. He's a very good scientist too. Anyway, so for those of you that don't know, the CLM, the Community Land Model, is part of the CESM, the Community Earth System Model, which is an Earth system model made by the community, and our part of it, the land, is quite a big section in Earth system modelling terms. We sort of have quite a big group that work on it. We recently froze the version 5 of the CLM a couple of months back. It was touch and go whether we would freeze it before my baby arrived, and so that was good. We managed to do it like basically 10 days before it did. So I'm going to discuss some of this new stuff we put inside of the CLM5, right? So lots of this is motivated by the demand from the community to integrate more plant traits into the model, to have more representation of things that you can measure in the field, and also to have more, I guess, sort of prognostic traits that we can, that sort of are not fixed in time and space, right? So Colin was talking about yesterday. And so one of the things we've done, one of the big developments we've done is CLM5 is a new nitrogen cycle. This is the CLM4 nitrogen cycle, which conceptualized sort of nitrogen limitation like this, as thanks to Peter, where we have carbon uptake, that's NPP, and we have a fixed leaf seed to N ratio, and then we have an amount of nitrogen uptake we get from the soil, which we should figure out, and if there isn't enough nitrogen to sort of match with all this carbon that we took up, we sort of burn off this extra carbon. This is the conceptualization of the nitrogen limitation here, and this fixed leaf seed to N ratio then determines VC max. So both of these things are fixed in time and space, right? And so CLM5 has lots more moving parts. It's much more complicated, which is better and worse. And what it does for all these different pools is that we have the same sort of carbon uptake from NPP, and then and from that carbon uptake, we divide that carbon uptake into two pools. Some of it we spend on taking up nitrogen uptake, so we have this concept that nitrogen uptake is now sort of an economic process where we have to pay the nitrogen we get back from the environment in terms of fixation and mycorrhizal fungi, etc. So we pay for some of the nitrogen uptake, and then that nitrogen uptake that we achieve goes into the leaf nitrogen pool, and depending on how much we manage to acquire from the environment, we have this variable leaf C to N. So we can change that according to the environmental conditions. And then from this leaf C to N ratio that we prognose in the model, is prognose a word? Anyway, we calculate VC max, but we do this in a way which attempts to optimize the photosynthetic capacity to coordinate the rates of carboxylation and light harvesting respiration, right? So this is a sort of optimality hypothesis, as is the Thun model on some level. And so it occurred to me during this meeting that we've definitely gone down this road of attempting to predict plant traits from what you may or may not call fundamental principles. Like Colin said yesterday, these are both optimality principles, and we could in principle have others if we chose to, but these are the two we decided to implement in the CLM for now. That's I guess, a different approach to, I guess later on we'll hear about the PFT map approach, and I think it's really interesting to sort of explore these two sort of different ways of going about representing plant traits in ESMs. And so this is my simple description of this model. For those of you who are interested, this is I got told off when I wrote this slide that it was too confusing for everyone. So if you don't care about the details, then just talk among yourselves. No, don't talk, but just look away now. Anyway, so what happens in this slide is that we have three different pools for nitrogen uptake: active uptake, fixation, and retranslocation from leaves. And then each time, so we work out how much each of those costs, right? And then we work out how much carbon we want to allocate to each of those pathways. It's sort of like an exchange rate mechanism. And then we decide how much to pay into each pathway. And then from that, we take the payments out of the carbon pool. We acquire the nitrogen into the nitrogen pool here. And this part of the model is called flex CN, just makes it possible to have flexible C to N ratios. We take these C to N ratios, put them into Luna, which is a model developed by Chongyang Zhu, and that works out the nitrogen that we allocate to respiratory, rubisco, and electron capture. Those things are all equalized, and that gives us our GBP, and we go back round again. So the new parameters in here are the target leaf C to N, right? So it has a target which the environment can modify, and then another parameter we're giving the model is the fraction of fixers in each plant functional type. So we don't have a fixer PFT per se. Each PFT can fix or not fix as you choose. And then another cost is the sort of empirical costs of active nitrogen uptake, fixation, and retranslocation. And these are kind of, particularly the active and retranslocation parameters are sort of almost free parameters in the model, particularly for active uptake, partly because the model of paying the environment carbon to retrieve nitrogen obviously is encompassing all of the really interesting sort of root exudation dynamics that we don't yet fully understand enough to put into a model, but maybe we'll one day. But it's kind of an overarching concept of that, which is why it's quite hard to measure, but it's nonetheless a principle we have in the model. And then we have other parameters that determine nitrogen flexibility, C to N flexibility, so how far from the target ratio your leaves can go. And then we have another property of the Luna model, which is how much nitrogen is stored by the leaf for a rainy day, or not rainy day. And so this model predicts C to N ratio, it predicts how much carbon we spend on fixation, it predicts VC max and J max, it predicts how much retranslocation comes out of the leaves. So these are all things that we can then test against, maybe get PFT maps, trait environment relationships, etc. So I hope that's interesting for everyone to think about in the future. The other part of the model that we've developed quite a lot is the drought response model. So CLM5 now has plant hydrodynamics, thanks to Daniel Kennedy, who's a PhD student from Columbia. And this, most of you are familiar with this kind of model. Basically, we go from the status quo, where we have a sort of function of soil moisture affecting gas exchange directly with two parameters, the wilting and critical moisture contents. And instead, we predict leaf water potential and the water potential at various nodes throughout the soil-to-leaf continuum here, based on the supply and demand balance of the plant. And this model is based on the work of Sperry and Love 2015, who proposed a quite simplified version of this system, which doesn't have any capacitance in it. But what it means is we can now use leaf water potential and sap flow data for validation of the model, whereas previously that was not possible inside of the CLM. And so those are the two kind of big vegetation-centric developments that we've done in this next round. All of these other things, including for some reason in poorly bulleted the Medellin stomatal conductance model, which we sort of put in at the last minute because we thought that was a better one than we had before. And so, so CLM5 has many more moving parts than its predecessors, partly because of this impetus to predict plant traits from theory and use more plant traits from the literature. And so, as you might imagine, when we ran it out of the box, very exciting, code runs, doesn't crash, woo, and it doesn't work very well in the first instance. Well, it isn't, it's not dreadful, but it's not, it doesn't immediately sort of win all the games. And so the question is, what do you do about that, right? So here's some dirty laundry about how our system models are made actually really in real life. So what typically happens is that you have a model which is a bit wrong, and you say, what are we going to do about that? And so what you can say is, well, previously we were using this parameter over here, and I found a new parameter which I got from this new study, which is better, and lo and behold, it makes the model better. So we'll put that in. It's still kind of like okay, but a bit better. And then you think, well, our model still needs improvement, so we have these two different possible algorithms for this poorly understood process. Currently we're using this one. Change to this one, everything gets a bit better. And so then your model might get a bit better, and you think, well, now I'm going to add a new structure to account for some new knowledge that I didn't have before. And obviously you only really do that if your model is a bit broken and you need to make it better. And then you think, well, at this point, if I use this value calibrated for a single site versus this value calibrated for another site for a parameter, then we get these two different results. And so basically how climate models work is that we kind of go around this kind of space in a sort of structural and parametric space trying to figure out how we should set the parameters of the model to achieve good results. And so of course the CLM has a lot of parameters, and only some of them are constrained by databases, the ones in green here. The ones which have lots of dots are ones which are PFT specific, and the ones that only have one dot are sort of generic for all PFTs. Some of them are constrained by TRI. As you can see, not all of them are constrained by TRI. Some of them are constrained by other databases, and some of them are really only constrained by sort of individual measurements or not at all. And so there's lots of dials we could plausibly tweak, and so the model is very sensitive to lots and lots of these things, right? So it's relatively trivial to demonstrate for almost any of these parameters that variation within the observed space has an enormous impact on the response of the system to all kinds of forcings. And so that's not really news. But what we thought was we could try and do better than the climate bias game by trying to frame this as an optimization problem. The idea being that we would try and calibrate the more tunable, unconstrained parameters to achieve better results for our model here. And so what we did here is we narrowed the parameter space with the one-at-a-time perturbation that I just showed you. And then we can use an emulator to find the best prediction of these global data products in the present day. So we spend a long time doing that with this sort of neural network emulation strategy, where we try and move the model from where we are in our parametric space to somewhere we think it might be better, using our emulator, which tells us how to sort of fill in that space. And we haven't sampled efficiently. And so I'm not going to go over this in great detail, but basically this was really hard, this sort of objective calibration process in this huge dimensional space. And we achieved some really interesting results, but ultimately it was really difficult to get there. And if you're interested, you can click on this link and watch a presentation about why the robots haven't won yet. But I'm not going to go over that now because it's probably not too super interesting to a trait-based audience. Basically, we tried automatic auto calibration, and it introduced some somewhat toxic answers. So we settled on hand-tuning a minimum number of the unconstrained parameters and leaving the rest as mean database values. So most of the values that we have are sort of the mean values from try, and some things are sort of attuned to give better answers. And the reason you might be thinking, well, that's a bit rubbish, but I guess what I'm trying to do is be sort of like really sort of upfront about how we get to the parameter set that we have, because it's probably it's a feature of the literature that the parameter set is often considered to be like a sort of magical parameter set that kind of arose by some sort of comprehensive process. And I think it's really important that people go and investigate how the model responds to alternative parameterizations. And I hope that the sort of existence of this tool will allow people to explore different parts of the parameter space. And so, did we get any better? This is a plot from the ILAM package, which is the International Land Model Benchmarking project, which is really great resource. It's open source, and you can go and download the software which allows you to test models against all of these different metrics of performance and generate this plot, which shows here on this side. Here we have the less well-performing models in red and the better performing models in green. Here we have the progression from CLM4 through CLM 4.5 to CLM 5, and each is run by two different meteorological driver data sets. And you can see that for most things we got better, happily, and for some things we got worse. So hopefully on that metric we did get a little bit better. But the default version is just one of many plausible configurations. And as you can probably imagine, the traits we put into the model also impact important things like the CO2 response. And so this is just a global analysis I did illustrating how varying all these parameters from low to high numbers sort of impacts all these different aspects of the output. If you look at NPP here, we have all these traits affecting the response of the model from going from CO2 of 380 to 550 ppm, right? And so you see that here, SLA top is the most affecting parameter, stomatal slope the second, leaf C to N the third, the nitrogen costs down here, and the fraction of fixes here. So lots of these elements of the nitrogen cycle affect the CO2 response. But then you might be thinking, well, that's all very well, but we've thought about all these other cool ideas that like go forward from this fixed PFT business, and that's a bit old-fashioned, thinking about fixed plant functional types, and that's true. And one of the reasons for that in particular is that in our automated calibration attempts, we repeatedly ran up against this problem, which is that the bias in one part of the distribution trades off with other parts of the distribution. So you can never make. We repeatedly found that if we got the evergreen tree, needle-leaf trees right in the eastern US, we got them wrong in the western US, and vice versa. If we got the broadleaf tropical trees right in the Amazon, then we overpredict them in Asia, and these kind of things are pervasive. And that's because in real life those are different plant types, and it'd be nice to have a better representation of plant trait space within our model. And interestingly, I yesterday learned that this problem the Hadley Centre have also come up against. So that's maybe a feature of the data. Who knows? And so from now on, I'm going to talk about the second model, which tries to better represent plant trait space in the sort of CLM context, and that's a model called FATES, right? And so for those of you who know that I used to work on the ecosystem demography model, ED, right? So FATES is also still just, that's what we've now rebranded our version of ED as, right? Because there's lots of different models called ED, and so we decided to give it a different name. And so this, I should say that this effort has been funded in large part and worked on by a Department of Energy project called NG Tropics, and Charlie Coven and Ryan Knox have done an amazing amount of work on this. So most of this is their kind of recent efforts. And so I've presented this like lots and lots of times. So you can sing along if you know the words to this part. But the model that we have changes the plant functional type tiling from a PFT based structure where we have needle leaf, broadleaf, bare ground, etc. trees in different parts of the grid cell notionally, to this time-since disturbance-based tiling where we represent the successional continuum from recently disturbed all the way through to mature ecosystems. So we conceptualize the landscape differently within the subgrid scale of the model. In addition to that, within each of these age classes, we now represent the different plant functional types as different plant cohorts within these age classes. So here at the beginning, we plant different plant functional type cohorts on the bare ground, and then those grow through the model and they compete, they shade each other, they exclude each other, they coexist, etc., until we achieve this kind of cohort-based mature ecosystem here. And this is all the dynamic process. And so, so the benefits of that idea are that the model simulates heterogeneity and light availability, which means it simulate competition for light, exclusion and coexistence, and that gives us a concept of mechanistic ecosystem assembly. It's then better, therefore better at simulating recovery after disturbance. The model's not reliant on climate envelopes at the moment because things emerge from their trait properties. And I think most critically for this community, we have an arbitrary PFT definition, right? So you can have essentially any types of plant functional types that you want. It's trivial to change them in the, when you're running the model. And so you can do lots of experiments about what controls biome boundaries. And I should just say that this is just one of a class of demographic models. Most sort of modeling centers are moving kind of in this direction at the moment. And so in our model, we also have this idea of this PPA, this perfect plasticity approximation, which basically sort of simplifies the light environment by dividing the canopy into those plants that are in the canopy and those plants that are in the understory here. And so it's necessary to know that for the next slide, which is a simulation of the evolution of the state of the model in time, right? And so we're sort of going forwards from when we started the model here. And what we have here is that the age of the patch, so that's the successional stage along this axis, and the size of the trees along here, so that's a two-dimensional space. And then the third dimension is the density of the plants in each of those boxes, right? So previously, all of this, this is for one PFT, but previously all of this space would have been one average plant type and a sort of an old, and it's a sort of CLM5 first generation type of model. And the blocky bits are just the binning that we did. And so we've been working a lot on trying to get these dynamics to work properly in the model, in the sense that we get the trees that just kind of are planted and grow along here in the canopy. This is this trajectory here. And as the trees grow, the canopy closes and some of the trees are demoted into the understory. And when they're demoted, they're a certain height, but they don't get any bigger after that. They just get older. And so these trees go along here. And then similarly, some of these canopies are disturbed, and then we get these trees that are released from suppression at a certain height, and then they grow at the same rate as the canopy trees, but eventually end up being bigger. So that's what the two axes represent in this model. And so within this framework, like I said, we can have arbitrary plant functional type specifications, and in this concept of this trait-based simulation, sorry, I shouldn't say trait-based simulation, this concept of representing plants on more of a continuum, we like to think about how we can use the model to represent cost-benefit trade-offs. And the cost-benefit trade-off I'm going to show you just as an arbitrary example is wood density versus P50, right? And this is from the Bolivian forest. And so what we can do is we can arbitrarily choose plants that exist along any sort of cost versus benefit trade-off surface, and we can do experiments to see how those play out in the simulation. And so this is the output from that particular trade-off. And what we find is that the high wood density plant functional type, which has a high tolerance of drought, tends to dominate areas in yellow here, which are drier. And we go through the continuum to the lower density plant functional type, which tends to dominate areas which are wetter, and because this one doesn't have much tolerance of drought. So that's relatively self-explanatory, but the reason I chose that is because it's self-explanatory, and that means that you can sort of easily visualize how this trait trade-off manifests itself in these different plant functional types as distributions. And so if this is my talk's one big advert, basically. The idea is that this is a tool which can be used by the community to do experiments with the trade-offs that emerge from our databases and our sort of meta-analyses. And so this code is now in a public repository and will be part of the CESM2 release, which is going to be happening in August. It also has another mirror to the ACME climate model, which is a Department of Energy climate model, which is notable because the code now exists in a separate module, right? So you can plug it into essentially any land surface model, and the cool thing is that it's all sort of on this open GitHub repository that can be developed collaboratively. So I think that's a really nice feature, which had nothing to do with, really. And so, in conclusion, there are two new CLM models to play with, CLM5 and CLM Fates. In both of the models, more plant traits are usable and meaningful, and more plant traits are predicted from theory and optimality ideas. More trait-environment relationships are emergent properties of the model. And Fates, in particular, is a tool for testing how trait trade-offs can shape biome boundaries of vegetation dynamics. CLM5, in contrast, is being run for CMIP6, and there's a lot of analysis that remains to be done. Obviously, the code all comes together at the end, and then people go forth and write papers on all the fundamental flaws that exist inside of the model. So you're welcome to all those flaws. And so, did we get any better? So we just certainly got quite a lot harder. That's for sure. We got better by some metrics, but that remains to be seen. It's definitely not faster, and I think it's stronger because we had a great time putting this together with this team of awesome people who've been working on the CLM5 with, and I think it's a really strong feature that we can get all these different sort of clever and creative people together to work on a single thing. So, yeah, come and play with us if you want. Right.